Proxy, tell shareholders all to vote my way. Tell shareholders all to hear my words, what they mean, what they say. Proxy, Proxy, can you keep them in the dark for life? Can you hide them from the waiting board? Oh, Proxy, Proxy, gonna take shareholders out tonight. Gonna show them my world. Oh, Proxyopoly! And welcome back, all you bulls and bears and betas out there, to the buzz of this Proxyopoly spin-off series we call the Proxyopoly Podcast. I'm your host, the Proxyopolist, formerly known as the Jackal of Trades, aka Jesse Cole Burdick, here again at your service with another exclusive, proprietary Proxyopoly TM research report for none other than Spotify Technologies SA. That's right, Proxyopolis. Following the Proxyopoly score for Deutsche Bank, BlackRock, Tesla, Walmart, ExxonMobil, Meta Platforms, and Amazon in Season 2 of the Proxyopoly TM podcast, we are now moving on to Season 3 with its premiere of the Proxyopoly TM score for Spotify. And without further delay, Spotify Technology SA, in its 2025 proxy statement, reveals a governance structure designed to preserve founder control with almost satirical efficiency. This Proxyopoly TM research report applies the 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings to critically assess Spotify's governance in anticipation of its annual general meetings. Drawing on the Proxyopoly TM proxy voting policy and guidelines, which value democratic ownership and accountability, we evaluate how Spotify's board and bylaws measure up in comparison. Despite Spotify's public success, its governance mechanisms exhibit a ironic contrast. A company built on sharing music is far less inclined to share power with shareholders. The final Proxyopoly TM score will distill these findings, quantifying just how entrenched and insulated Spotify's leadership has become. We also include voting recommendations for each board nominee: for, against, abstain, or withhold, with one-line rationales as well as supplemental recommendations for improving Spotify's governance. All analysis is grounded in factual public data, delivered in a formal tone with subtle, dry undertones. In a summary of our findings, Spotify's founders have maintained an iron grip control via a beneficiary certificate scheme that gives them 10 votes per share. This has created a Proxyopoly dynamic. Ordinary shareholders' influence is largely illusory. and governance checks like independent board leadership or shareholder proposals are effectively neutered. The Proxyopoly TM ratings reflect a company deep in entrenchment mode. As detailed in the following analysis, we find a proxy accumulation resistance in proxy fortress territory and executive entrenchment approaching autocratic levels, among other metrics. Minor shareholders have sent small signals of discontent. For example, approximately 7 to 10% of shareholders voted against re-electing the founders at the annual general meeting, and approximately 11% opposed the board's pay plan. But these protests remain largely symbolic under Spotify's current power structure. We proceed with a detailed breakdown of each Proxyopoly TM rating, including how the score was calculated and the context behind it. This is followed by our Proxyopoly TM4 score for Spotify, and a final recommendation chart. A section with board nominee voting recommendations providing guidance on each director candidate, and a supplemental recommendation section which suggests policy changes or structural reforms to improve Spotify's corporate governance. The analysis is factual, yet laced with dry satirical irony, acknowledging almost feudal corporate governance at play while maintaining an objective, data-driven tone. Proxyopoly TM rating number 1. The Proxy Accumulation Resistance, acronym PAR. By definition, the Proxy Accumulation Resistance as a Proxyopoly TM rating measures how difficult it is for outside shareholders to accumulate enough proxies to influence board composition on key decisions. Factors include ownership concentration, insider voting power, and procedural roadblocks. Spotify's PAR is deeply negative, reflecting a near impenetrable fortress of insider voting control. Key contributors to this proxy fortress status are the founders and their founders' supervotes. Spotify's co-founders, Daniel Ek and Martin Lorentzon, engineered a stealth dual-class structure via beneficiary certificates. For each ordinary share they held at its initial public offering, IPO, they received 10 beneficiary certificates, each granting 1 extra vote and 0 economic rights. As of the direct listing, this amounted to approximately 373 million super voting rights, created purely to cement their control. The company itself bluntly acknowledges these certificates were issued to provide our founders with control, quote unquote. Such an arrangement means that although Eck and Lorentzon's economic stake is far below 50% actual voting shares, their combined voting power at the AGM has been in reality around 80%. More than enough to outvote all other shareholders on any matter. In Proxyopoly TM terms, this is the epitome of, quote, insurmountable resistance to shareholder-led influence, unquote. Outside investors could marshal every available proxy and still come nowhere close to prevailing in a contest against the founders' voting bloc. Other key contributors to the proxy accumulation resistance is the concentrated ownership and passive support. Even beyond the raw vote count, Spotify benefits from the inertia of passive investors. Large index funds, if holding Spotify, have little incentive to fight losing battles. Many likely follow management's recommendations. Spotify's foreign private issuer status and controlled company profile may also discourage activist buildup. Why spend resources when the deck is so stacked? This Proxyopoly asks. No significant activist investor has attempted a proxy fight at Spotify, rationally so, given the structural odds. The historical proxy turnover is essentially nil. There have been no successful dissident campaigns which aligns with a proxy accumulation resistance of a fortified castle, in proxy terms. Another key contributor to the proxy accumulation resistance are the procedural roadblocks. Luxembourg law, in Spotify's jurisdiction, adds extra hurdles. The proxy statement notes that only holders of record on the set date may vote, and transferring shares after the record date disqualifies voting rights. It even warns that breach of this could result in criminal sanctions, a stark deterrent to any last-minute proxy maneuvering. Furthermore, shareholders cannot easily add agenda items or nominations. They must navigate Luxembourg's requirements, and the company pointedly reserves the right, quote-unquote, to reject proposals that don't meet strict criteria. In short, procedural nuance combined with concentrated votes ensure no insurgent shareholder campaign can gain traction. Given these factors, Spotify's proxy accumulation resistance as a Proxyopoly TM rating has been calculated to be approximately negative 0.60, planting it firmly in the proxy fortress range under negative 0.50 on the Proxyopoly TM index. This indicates that external shareholders face extraordinary difficulty in accumulating proxies against management. In fact, difficulty may be an understatement. Barring a founder voluntarily switching sides, an outside coalition has virtually no path to victory on any contested ballot item. The Proxyopoly TM proxy voting policy and guidelines frown upon such total insulation as it undermines basic shareholder democracy. Here, however, that principle has been checkmated by design. Spotify is essentially impervious to proxy contest threats, and its proxy accumulation resistance as a Proxyopoly TM rating reflects that harsh reality. It is almost as if Spotify's governance motto is vote all you want, Eck and Lorentzon will still decide. The beneficiary certificate system is a masterstroke of proxy accumulation resistance, or in plain terms, making sure no single voter can accumulate enough votes to challenge the status quo. The irony that a company whose platform empowers millions of listeners is so expertly designed to disempower its own shareholders will not be lost on the students and listeners of corporate governance. Moving on to Proxyopoly TM rating number 2, we have the Bylaw Fortification Index, or acronym BFI. By definition, the Bylaw Fortification Index evaluates how the company's charter, bylaws, and corporate structure fortify management's position or inhibit reform. It looks at structural defenses, such as classified boards, supermajority vote requirements, poison pills, dual-class stock, etc. In Proxyopoly TM's analysis, Spotify's bylaws and corporate structure present a hardened structure, earning Spotify Technology SA a BFI Proxyopoly TM rating in the positive 0.7 to positive 0.8 range, which falls under a hardened structure from positive 0.10 to positive 0.99 on the Proxyopoly TM index. While Spotify's governance documents might lack some classic defenses, for example, the board is not staggered, all directors stand for re-election or election annually. The fortifications that do exist, however, are formidable and tailored to its founders' advantage. Key factors influencing the Bylaw Fortification Index include dual-class structure in effect. By far the biggest fortification is the aforementioned dual-class equivalence setup. Although Spotify has only one class of ordinary shares on paper, the beneficiary certificates create a de facto dual-class voting structure with an extreme 10-to-1 vote ratio in favor of the founders. This is the kind of structural armor that Proxyopoly TM's Bylaw Fortification Index weighs heavily. The certificates are baked into Spotify's Articles of Association. Up to 1.4 billion of them are authorized for issuance without separate shareholder approval. Such a provision is effectively a self-replenishing poison pill against shareholder influence. It guarantees that as the company issues new shares or if founders' ownership dilutes over time, the board can hand out more votes to the insiders to maintain control. In Proxyopoly TM terms, this single element pushes Bylaw Fortification high into the positive range on the Proxyopoly TM index. Few governance structures are as explicitly designed to withstand or preempt reform attempts as giving insiders 20 times the voting power of outsiders. The board has discretion to set between 1 and 20 votes per share and chose 10. This mechanism is entrenchment by charter, a feature very much aligned with a corporate minefield, if it were any more extreme. Another key factor influencing the Bylaw Fortification Index includes supermajority requirements and voting thresholds. According to the proxy statement, all annual general meeting agenda items require only a simple majority to pass, which seems shareholder friendly at first glance. However, one must remember who holds that majority. With the founders controlling approximately 80% of votes, a simple majority rule simply means the founders will always prevail regardless of quorum. In Luxembourg, where Spotify is located and its applicable jurisdiction legally, certain fundamental changes like amending articles or approving mergers would by law require higher thresholds. But given the ownership structure, those thresholds are trivially met by insiders and insurmountable by outsiders. In practice, the effective voting threshold for minority shareholders is irrelevant. Whether it's 50% or 67%, they don't have it. Thus, while on paper Spotify doesn't impose onerous supermajority requirements on all shareholders, the control position of insiders nullifies the impact of this seeming openness with dual-class share structures. Another key factor in consideration for the Bylaw Fortification Index are the takeover defenses. Spotify has no known shareholder rights plan, or, quote, poison pill, unquote, adopted, likely because it doesn't need one. Any hostile acquirer would have to pry shares and votes from the founders' hands, an unlikely prospect. The structure itself is the defense. There are also no proxy access provisions disclosed, no mechanism for minority shareholders to nominate directors on the ballot easily, which means the only way to challenge the board's composition is a full-on proxy fight. An exercise in futility as discussed under the proxy accumulation resistance. Additionally, as a controlled company under New York Stock Exchange rules, Spotify is exempt from certain governance requirements that other companies face, like having a majority independent board or fully independent nominating and compensation committees. While Spotify's board does include mostly independent directors by choice, the controlled company exemption under New York Stock Exchange rules is itself a bylaw level fortification. It signals that the company can legally opt out of certain shareholder-friendly practices. For instance, a controlled company need not have an independent board chair or even a lead independent director. And indeed, Spotify's chairman is also its CEO and founder, with no mandatory independent counterweight. Shareholder meeting and nomination procedures are the last key factor in consideration for the Bylaw Fortification Index. Luxembourg corporate law requires an advance convening notice and sets procedural strictness for meetings. Spotify's 2025 proxy statement and materials indicate shareholders or certificate holders who wish to add items to the AGM agenda had to comply with stringent requirements, and the company reserved broad discretion to reject proposals not meeting those formalities. Moreover, any shareholder who wasn't on record by the record date, almost 2 months before the meeting, or who transfers shares after that date, loses the right to vote at the annual general meeting. These rules, while legal standard in Luxembourg, act as subtle fortifications. They prevent last-minute shifts in ownership or agenda items that could facilitate an insurgency. Everything must be locked down well in advance, which naturally favors the steady incumbents. Considering all these elements, Spotify's Bylaw Fortification Index is solidly positive. The lack of a staggered board or explicit poison pill keeps it from maxing out at a corporate minefield above positive 1.0 on the Proxyopoly TM index, but the beneficiary certificate dual class system alone warrants a hardened structure rating. Some might argue it's the equivalent of encasing the company in concrete. The Proxyopoly TM Proxy Voting Policy and Guidelines note that dual class or similar arrangements are strong negative factors as they determine how power is retained or shielded. Quote unquote. In Spotify's case, power is unequivocally shielded behind a wall of extra votes. The Bylaw Fortification Index of roughly positive 0.80 reflects a governance architecture that strongly inhibits reform in practical terms. Amending any bylaw or introducing any governance change that the founders dislike is impossible, not by coincidence, but by design. If regular companies have defenses like moats or ramparts, Spotify's bylaws are more akin to a high-tech force field, invisible to the casual observer but utterly impenetrable. One could also admire the ingenuity of its bylaws. The founders found a way to achieve dual-class control without technically having a dual-class stock, playing within the letter of the law while defeating its spirit. For investors hoping for more balanced governance, that is a bitter pill to swallow. Fortunately, however, not a poison pill, since none is needed when you already have an impregnable dual-class structure without dual-class stock. Moving on to Proxyopoly TM rating number 3. The Shareholder Hostility Quotient. By definition, the Shareholder Hostility Quotient, acronym SHQ, gauges how management and the board treat shareholder input, whether they embrace dialogue and proposals or resist to undermine them. It considers the rejection rate of shareholder proposals, management's stance on governance reforms, ease of engagement, tactics against dissidents, and even the tone towards investors. In Proxyopoly TM's analysis, Spotify's shareholder hostility quotient lands in the defensive range, approximately positive 0.70, indicating a management posture that, while not overly hostile in rhetoric, is decidedly unaccommodating in practice. The environment for shareholder influence at Spotify is characterized less by open confrontation. There are few shareholder proposals to reject outright, and more by a polite but firm exclusion of shareholders from meaningful governance influence. Here's how Proxyopoly TM arrives at this rating for the shareholder hostility quotient. Shareholder proposals. None on the ballot. A telling sign of Spotify's shareholder relations is the absence of any shareholder-sponsored proposals at its 2025 annual general meeting or any recent annual general meeting. In markets like the United States, it's common for investors to put forward resolutions on environmental social governance issues or relevant governance changes. Spotify, however, as a foreign private issuer, is not subject to U.S. proxy rules that enforce inclusion of such proposals, and under Luxembourg law, the bar for adding an agenda item is high. The result? Minority shareholders have no recorded history of successfully bringing matters to a vote. This could be read two ways. Perhaps investors are content, or more likely, they recognize the futility. The shareholder hostility quotient framework looks at the rejection rate of shareholder proposals. In Spotify's case, the rate is 100%, because none ever make it to the ballot. Management doesn't even need to formally oppose proposals if they never see the light of day. This points to a passive hostility. Rather than battling dissenting ideas, the company's structure and policies simply prevent those ideas from surfacing. Other means of arriving at the shareholder hostility quotient are management opposition to reforms. On issues like creating an independent board chair, establishing one share, one vote principles, or introducing say-on-pay votes, Spotify's leadership has shown no inclination to yield. For example, despite best practices, Spotify's CEO remains chairman of the board, and the company has given no indication it might separate those roles or even appoint a lead independent director. Any proposal to change that, common in other companies' proxies via shareholder resolution, is conspicuously absent, presumably because it would not be welcome. The company also has not volunteered an advisory vote on executive compensation or say on pay, a reform many foreign issuers adopt to align with global norms. The tone from the top is that current governance is just fine. In Proxyopoly TM terms, however, this is a management that views shareholder-driven changes as unnecessary and unwelcome, consistent with a defensive shareholder hostility quotient. Management's position dominates any discussion. Other means of arriving at the shareholder hostility quotient are engagement and transparency. Spotify does maintain an investor relations apparatus and holds earnings calls, etc. So it's not as though management refuses to speak to shareholders at all. However, the meaningful access to senior leadership beyond scripted communications is limited. With founders holding the cards, there is little incentive for them to actively solicit minority investor input on strategy or governance. Engagement tends to be top-down. The company informs shareholders of decisions. It does not ask permission. The Proxyopoly TM proxy voting policy and guidelines look at whether shareholder voices can impact corporate outcomes. At Spotify, such impact is virtually nil. Even large institutional investors, those not part of the insider group, can't force a discussion on, say, implementing an equity compensation plan or changing a policy because they lack leverage. Management likely conducts the minimum required outreach to avoid alienating the market, but any suggestions contrary to founder vision likely disappear into a black box. This aligns with a, quote, management position domination scenario. Other means of arriving at the shareholder hostility quotient are tactics and tone. Since overt dissent is rare, Spotify hasn't had to deploy heavy-handed tactics like litigation to exclude proposals or last-minute meeting rule changes. These structural barriers do the job. However, the risk factor language in its filings does frame any potential loss of founder control as a risk to the business. This implies the company line is that maintaining the status quo and keeping shareholders at bay is for shareholders' own good. There is a subtle framing of outside proposals or attempts as potentially disruptive. The tone of the proxy materials is civil and formal, but one can read between the lines. Shareholders are cordially invited, quote-unquote, to attend the meeting, yet the agenda gives them nothing of their own to decide except ratifying what the board puts forth. Is a genteel form of hostility. A velvet glove over an iron fist. Nowhere does Spotify demonize shareholders openly. No statements calling activists corporate raiders, quote-unquote, or anything of the such, which is why we term it defensive rather than in total hostile territory. But from a results-oriented perspective, the quote-unquote net friction for shareholders trying to effect change is extremely high. That friction is by design, not by accident. Another means of arriving at the shareholder hostility quotient includes evidence of shareholder frustration. The only glimmers of pushback we see are in voting results. Notably, a significant minority withheld support from key insiders in 2025. Approximately 7.4% of votes cast were against Daniel Ek's re-election and approximately 9.6% against Martin Lorentzon's re-election. These are relatively high dissent levels for uncontested director elections, indicating some institutional investors chose to send a message, perhaps objecting to combined chair and CEO roles, lack of independence, or simply the dual-class voting structure. Furthermore, a notable 11.5% of votes opposed the proposal on director remuneration, perhaps reflecting discontent with either the pay package itself or a way to protest remuneration executives say on pay generally. In a truly hostile environment, management might dismiss these numbers as inconsequential, as more responsive management might reach out to understand concerns. So far, there's no public indication of Spotify's board has done the latter. The dissent didn't change any outcomes. All directors were handily re-elected, and say on pay was approved. And there's no sign of concessions or reforms afterward. This hints that the board views such shareholder expression as something to tolerate but not act upon. Summing up, Spotify's shareholder hostility quotient of positive 0.70 means the company is generally unresponsive to shareholder input unless it aligns with management's preset agenda. There's a baseline respect in communications. No open insults, but effectively shareholder rights are treated as a formality. Dissent is quietly ignored and real decision-making remains insulated. The shareholder hostility quotient isn't pegged at hostile territory or what would be above positive 1.0 on the Proxyopoly TM index because Spotify isn't actively attacking dissidents or publicly demeaning investor concerns. Instead, it's politely ignoring them. This hostility by omission, a governance culture that smiles and nods, then proceeds as it wishes. For investors, it means their voice carries minimal weight, which is exactly what the founders intended when crafting this governance system. One might say Spotify's approach to shareholder engagement is don't say no, just never ask. By never giving shareholders a platform to voice disagreement, no proposals, no votes on their ideas, the company avoids the messy optics of having to say no. Yet the effect is the same. It's a bit like holding a Q&A where all the difficult questions magically never get picked. In the grand concert of Spotify's corporate governance, the shareholders can hum along in the background, but the founders hold the microphone and choose the set list. Moving on to Proxyopoly TM rating number 4, Executive Entrenchment Factor, acronym EEF or EEF. By definition, Executive Entrenchment Factor EEF measures how tightly the CEO and top executives have cemented their control. Role concentration, for example, the chair-CEO duality, tenure, lack of succession plans, influence over the board, and whether checks and balances like performance-based evaluations or say-on pay are weak. In Proxyopoly TM's analysis, Spotify's Executive Entrenchment Factor, or EEF, is alarmingly high. About positive 1.20 high, putting it into the autocratic executive power zone. In simpler terms, CEO Chairperson Daniel Ek is entrenched to a degree that his removal by shareholders or the board is virtually impossible, short of a scenario where he himself agrees, or in the unlikely event his co-founder turns on him. Several factors drive this conclusion for the Executive Entrenchment Factor, or EEF. Combined Chair CEO roles. A common theme in these Proxyopoly TM episodes. Daniel Ek serves as both Chief Executive Officer and Chairperson of the board. This consolidation of roles is a classic entrenchment red flag. It means Ek controls the agenda of board meetings, has significant influence over which issues the board considers, and in general, there is no higher authority within the company to provide oversight of Ek's performance. Normally, best practices suggest having an independent chairperson or at least a strong lead independent director to check a powerful CEO. At Spotify, the founder is essentially his own boss on the board. The proxy explicitly lists Ek's position and highlights that as chairperson, he guides the vision and strategy, quote unquote. Roles that in a more balanced governance system would be shared. With Ek as chairperson, the board's ability to challenge or replace him is minimal, since he can control board discussions and has the shareholder votes to back his position. Another factor under consideration for the Executive Entrenchment Factor, or EEF, is founder control ownership. Amplifying the CEO chairperson duality is X and Lorentzon's combined voting control of approximately 80%. Even if hypothetically every other director on the board, most of whom are independent, decided the CEO needed to go, the founders as shareholders could simply remove those directors or refuse to re-elect any director who opposed them at the next AGM. In practice, independent directors know that crossing the founders could be a career-limiting move. They can be ousted from the board at the stroke of a pen, or at least at the next shareholder vote, which the founders dominate. This creates an inherent power asymmetry between the executives and the board. The independent directors, no matter how qualified, lack real power if the chairperson/CEO chooses not to heed them. It's worth noting that Martin Lorentzon, the other founder, though no longer chair as of 2016, remains on the board and presumably a close ally of Eck. This means Eck even has inside partners on the board who co-founded the company with him, further reducing the likelihood of any internal revolt. The executive entrenchment factor, or ETH, considers shareholder tenure as well. Eck has been at the helm since 2006, nearly 19 years now. His long tenure with no hint of succession adds to the entrenchment risk. There's no indication of any succession plan or grooming of a potential replacement. Instead, it's hard to imagine the concept of, quote, replacement, unquote, even being entertained. Another factor under consideration for the executive entrenchment factor, or ETH, board independence and alignment. On paper, Spotify's board has a majority of independent directors. 8 out of 10 nominees in 2025 are technically independent of management, all except Eck and Lorentzon, with Shishir Mehrotra being a former advisor but not a current employee. However, independence in form does not equal independence in power. Several independent directors have significant ties or loyalties that align them with management's perspective. For example, Shishir Mehrotra was a strategic advisor to Eck for 2 years, potentially making him more management-friendly. Barry McCarthy, while independent now, was Spotify's CFO until 2020. He's essentially part of the company's recent history and likely aligned with its leadership ethos. Woody Marshall represented a major early investor, thus may be viewed as an ally who helped bring Spotify to market. Plus, he's been on the board since 2015, overlapping significantly with Eck's tenure. These dynamics suggest that a significant portion of the board is either personally loyal to Eck, philosophically aligned, or at least not inclined to challenge Eck aggressively. Even truly independent voices, for example, Padmasree Warrior, Mona Sutphen, etc., who are accomplished individuals from outside industries, know the boundaries. The structural fact is that the CEO founder holds the keys to the kingdom. This soft power further entrenches the executive. Another factor underlying the executive entrenchment factor, or ETH, say on pay and performance accountability. One avenue shareholders have to express dissatisfaction with executives is the advisory vote on executive compensation, common in many markets. Spotify does not offer a say on pay vote. It's not required for them. They haven't opted in. As such, there is no regular referendum on Daniel Eck's pay package or performance from the investor perspective. Interestingly, as founder, CEO, Eck's wealth is mostly in stock. His salary is likely modest by Fortune 500 standards, and he hasn't faced the kind of shareholder ire over pay that perhaps a non-founder might, but the principle is that shareholders lack even this basic feedback mechanism. Additionally, compensation committee accountability is moot. Under controlled company status, the compensation committee doesn't even have to be fully independent by rule. Any vote against its members by shareholders can be overridden by founder votes. The discharge of liability vote, agenda item number 3, was a rubber stamp in 2025, signaling shareholders did not or could not hold directors accountable for anything in 2024. Again, the discharge of liability vote was a rubber stamp in 2025. signaling shareholders did not or could not hold directors accountable for anything that happened or that they did in 2024. Another factor in consideration for the executive entrenchment factor is succession planning transparency. There's no public evidence of a CEO succession plan. Even ex-age, early 40s, and success, the board likely hasn't pushed the issue. But if penalizes the absence of a contingency plan. If something were to happen to Eck, or if he unexpectedly stepped aside, it's unclear if the company has prepared a successor or if it would trigger a power struggle with Lorentzon as the largest shareholder perhaps stepping in. The lack of disclosed succession planning is common in founder-led firms, but it does not contribute to entrenchment. It means even the concept of someone else running the company is not actively on the table. The founders probably believe, perhaps rightly, that they are uniquely qualified to lead Spotify. That mindset can perhaps lead to blind spots in governance. Given these considerations, the executive entrenchment factor of positive 1.20 indicates entrenchment beyond the norm, verging on absolute. In Proxyopoly TM terms, quote, removal is virtually impossible, unquote, for the top executive, which fits Spotify's case. The board is structurally and perhaps psychologically unable to oppose Daniel Ek in any serious matter. He is the architect of the company's strategy and holds all the cards to defy any challengers. It's important to note that a high EEF is not a judgment of Ek's competence or Spotify's performance. It's strictly about governance risk. Indeed, Spotify might argue that having a visionary founder firmly in charge is beneficial, but from a governance perspective, this level of executive insularity is risky. It means fewer checks on strategic decisions, and if performance falters, shareholders have no practical recourse to demand a leadership change. The company's fate is tied to one or two individuals. Proxyopoly TM proxy voting policy and guidelines see an unchecked power as a long-term concern, as it contravenes, quote, mechanisms capable of checking or replacing executive leadership, unquote. Those mechanisms at Spotify are effectively nullified. In the game of Proxyopoly TM, Daniel Ek holds the deed to Boardwalk and Park Place with a stack of hotels on them, metaphorically, and everyone else is just hoping to not go bankrupt. The entrenchment is so thorough that one wonders if the board meetings are more akin to an audience with a king. To be fair, King Daniel doesn't appear to be tyrannical, but by all accounts he's an innovative leader. But the governance structure ensures it would be exceedingly hard to depose him should the need ever arise. In a wry sense, Spotify has achieved what many authoritarian regimes aspire to: the trappings of a republic, independent institutions or elections with the reality of one party or one person rule. The executive entrenchment factor captures that by giving Spotify an autocratic score, a label that is almost literal here. Moving on to Proxyopoly TM rating number 5, we have the Regulatory Evasion Measure, or REM. By definition, Regulatory Evasion Measure evaluates how a company navigates, influences, or sidesteps regulatory oversight. It looks at the gap between the company's power and the extent of regulation or scrutiny it faces, including lobbying efforts, jurisdictional arbitrage, choosing favorable laws, and any history of skating past enforcement. In Proxyopoly TM's analysis, Spotify's REM, regulatory evasion measure, is moderately positive, around positive 0.30, indicating slightly elevated evasiveness. The company enjoys certain regulatory advantages and has strategically positioned itself to minimize regulatory friction. However, it's not in the realm of a true systemic shadow operator, which would be above positive 1.0 on the Proxyopoly TM index, and implies a huge global entity in evading significant regulation. Instead, Spotify's REM reflects a mix of regulatory arbitrage and the relatively light regulatory environment of its industry, tempered by the fact that it does face some oversight and indeed calls for more oversight on its competitors. Key points in the regulatory evasion measure include jurisdictional choice, Luxembourg and beyond. Spotify is incorporated in Luxembourg as an SA, a jurisdiction known for business-friendly corporate laws and potentially favorable tax arrangements. By being a European company listed in the United States, Spotify arguably picks and chooses the most advantageous aspects of both worlds. It avails itself of United States capital markets but avoids some stricter U.S. regulatory requirements. For example, as a foreign private issuer, Spotify is exempt from certain U.S. proxy and disclosure rules. No 14A filing in the U.S., but more leeway on executive compensation disclosures, etc. It files an annual 20F, but is not subject to the SEC say-on-pay rules or the exacting 8K disclosure regime for material events, etc. This can be seen as a mild form of regulatory arbitrage. The company follows Luxembourg and European Union requirements, which in some areas are less onerous or different than U.S. ones. The beneficiary certificate structure, as previously mentioned, might not have been as easily executed under U.S. state corporate law. It's a unique mechanism that Luxembourg law allowed. By using this mechanism, Spotify effectively sidestepped U.S. exchange norms on one share, one vote principles. Indeed, some major indices exclude companies with unequal voting rights, and Spotify risked that. FTSE Russell and others considered such exclusions, which is itself a reaction by quasi-regulators to such evasive structures. So in terms of regulatory classification, Spotify is a large-cap tech company that isn't subject to some governance regulations as a similarly sized U.S. company would be. This bumps the regulatory evasion Proxyopoly TM rating positive 0.30. Other key points in the regulatory evasion measure include lobbying and policy influence. Spotify is not known for heavy lobbying in any way, say oil or finance companies are, but it does engage in policy influence, especially in the digital media and platform competition space. Notably, Spotify has been an outspoken critic of Apple's App Store policies. It even initiated an European Union antitrust complaint against Apple. This is somewhat ironic from a Proxyopoly TM perspective. Spotify advocates for regulatory intervention when it comes to its competitors, arguing Apple and other gatekeepers need reining in for fair competition, but in its own governance, it has constructed a system relatively immune to external intervention. Spotify's lobbying expenditures in the U.S. have been modest, but focus on issues like music licensing, copyright, and platform competition. There is no evidence of Spotify's engaging in nefarious, quote, revolving door tactics, unquote, or capturing regulators. In fact, one could argue Spotify faces a regulatory deficit in areas like artist compensation. There have been calls, for example, in the European Union and United Kingdom for better regulation of streaming royalties to ensure artists are paid fairly. To date, Spotify has navigated those discussions without major regulatory impositions on its business model. It often positions itself as a willing participant in finding solutions, thus shaping regulation to be more favorable or at least not damaging to its business model. This subtle influence, cooperating just enough to avoid harsh outcomes, is a form of regulatory savvy that keeps its burden light. Other key factors in the regulatory evasion measure include compliance and enforcement history. Spotify has not been at the center of major legal enforcement action like some tech peers. No massive privacy fines like Meta platforms, no securities fraud cases, etc. It has some run-ins, such as class actions from songwriters about unpaid royalties, which it settled by agreeing to pay and creating a database following the Music Modernization Act in the U.S. Overall, the company's compliance track record is relatively clean in terms of government actions. This suggests either good compliance or operating in a space that hasn't attracted heavy regulation yet. There's also an element of externalizing regulatory risk. Issues around content, for example, misinformation on podcasts, have stirred public controversy, but instead of heavy regulation, Spotify has mostly faced public pressure and navigated it via self-incident rather than any formal regulatory penalty. That indicates a flexible approach to stave off calls for regulation, do the minimum needed via internal policies to avoid government stepping in. So far, that's worked. Another key factor to take into consideration for the regulatory evasion measure includes systemic importance. Spotify is a major player in music streaming, but it's not a systemically vital institution like a bank or a utility. Its regulatory evasion measure is nowhere near something like a global bank that exploits regulatory gaps. However, in the creative industry, Spotify's outsized influence, market share in streaming, effect on artists' livelihoods, etc., has raised questions that could invite regulatory scrutiny. The fact that no comprehensive regulatory regime has yet been imposed, for example, a mandated minimum royalty rate or oversight of playlist algorithms, means Spotify operates relatively freely. It arguably benefits from a lag in regulatory adaptation. Lawmakers are still catching up to the streaming era. Balancing these points, a regulatory evasion measure of positive 0.30 is justified. Spotify does intelligently avoid stricter oversight in some ways through incorporation choices and voluntary measures to appease stakeholders, but it isn't completely unregulated or immune. If anything, it sometimes campaigns for regulation on other big tech platforms, which could indirectly benefit Spotify's competitive position. This isn't the behavior of a company evading all regulation. It is more nuanced. It's playing regulatory chess, one move ahead, ensuring it's not cornered by the rules, occasionally sacrificing a pawn, conceding on minor issues to avoid a bigger rule that could constrain it. Proxyopoly TM framework would say Spotify navigates or influences regulation without consequence to a fair degree. Hence the elevated evasiveness label. It's not blatantly flouting laws, no evidence of major illegal evasion, but it's structured to minimize their bite. The regulatory evasion measure is the lowest of Spotify's 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings, which aligns with intuition. The strongest entrenching forces are internal, governance, and control, rather than external regulatory evasion. However, it still contributes positively to the overall Proxyopoly TM score, demonstrating that Spotify has avoided many of the market accountability mechanisms that regulation can impose. In a way, Spotify has written its own sheet music when it comes to regulation. By picking a friendly home base and dancing between European Union and United States rules, it enjoys a kind of regulatory syncopation, offbeat enough that regulators can't quite keep up and haven't quite caught up. When the music gets too loud or public outcry over something Spotify has done, Spotify lowers the volume just enough to keep the party going without the cops or regulators showing up and shutting it down. The regulatory evasion measure captures this light-footed maneuvering. Spotify isn't a regulatory outlaw by any stretch, but it certainly isn't marching in lockstep to a heavy regulatory drum either. Concluding with the composite Proxyopoly TM score for the final assessment, combining the 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings as previously discussed, we calculate Spotify's overall Proxyopoly TM score as a weighted composite. Going over the Proxyopoly TM ratings previously discussed before calculating the final Proxyopoly TM score, Spotify Technology SA has scored a negative 0.60 for the proxy accumulation resistance, positive 0.80 for the Bylaw Fortification Index, positive 0.70 for the Shareholder Hostility Quotient, positive 1.20 for the Executive Entrenchment Factor, or EVA, positive 0.30 for the Regulatory Evasion Measure. Thus, for Spotify, we will now calculate the final Proxyopoly TM score. Well, it looks like we have the final Proxyopoly TM score for Spotify, and it comes out to approximately positive 0.48 on the Proxyopoly TM index. On a continuum, where 0.00 is balanced governance, negative scores indicating shareholder-friendly tilt, and positive scores indicating entrenchment and insulation by a Proxyopoly. This positive 0.48 Proxyopoly score signifies a company firmly skewed toward entrenched management, favorable governance, though not the most extreme case in existence. In Proxyopoly TM parlance, one might say Spotify has moderate to high entrenchment overall. It reflects that across multiple dimensions, from voting power to board control to regulatory strategy, Spotify deviates from democratic ownership principles in favor of concentrated control. Sources included company's 2025 proxy statement and public filings. Proxyopoly TM rating definitions outlined herein. In plain language, Spotify's governance is optimized to keep its founders in charge with minimal interference from shareholders or regulation. The final Proxyopoly TM score of positive 0.48, while shy of the most egregious positive 1.00 territory on the Proxyopoly TM index, is nonetheless high. Most companies with more standard governance, one share, one vote, or independent shares, etc., would score near zero or in the negatives if particularly shareholder empowering. Spotify is the opposite. Every category except regulatory evasion measures shows a bias toward control and entrenchment. The high executive entrenchment factor and bylaw fortification index especially dominate the narrative. Internally, the governance design is tailor-made for longevity of current leadership. It's worth noting that Spotify's Proxyopoly TM score is not a judgment on its business success or ethics, but strictly on governance structure. Investors in Spotify essentially have to trust the vision and stewardship of Daniel Ek and Martin Lorentzon because of the usual levers of accountability are weak. The Proxyopoly TM score crystallizes that trust requirement into a number. At positive 0.48, Spotify ranks it as a more entrenched than the most usual public companies. It's likely on par with other founder-controlled tech firms, albeit without dual-class stock. It achieved similar control via a novel method. For context, a hypothetical company with a balanced governance, say widely held stock, independent board leadership, routine engagement with shareholders, might score around 0.00 or even slightly negative. On the other hand, a notorious governance outlier. Imagine a company with a supermajority owner, permanent staggered board, multi-anti-takeover provisions, hypothetically, and open hostility to shareholders could score above 1.0 or higher. Spotify is closer to the latter, though it maintains a veneer of modern governance. Diverse, talented board, etc., which keeps its score below the absolute maximum. In other words, Spotify's governance report card reads, substantial control issues, some cosmetic compliance with best practices, but underlying power dynamics are very one-sided. Final recommendation. In the framework of Proxyopoly TM's insightful proxy voting policy and guidelines, investors concerned with long-term governance health should be very wary of an entrenched setup. If one believes in the current management and strategy, the structure provides stability, but it also means traditional shareholder oversight is largely absent. Our final recommendation is that Spotify's leadership and shareholders alike consider steps to reduce this score over time, meaning adopt more shareholder-friendly measures, which we detail in the supplemental recommendations section of this proprietary Proxyopoly TM research report, which you can find exclusively on the Patreon, which can be found on the Linktree, which is linktree/nascarcosa. Until then, the Proxyopoly TM score of positive 0.48 serves as a cautionary flag. Power, like music, is best enjoyed when not concentrated into few hands. Before we dive into the next section of this podcast, and again, we try to divide this podcast episode into 3 parts. This will be an intermission for the Proxyopolists at home to digest the information they have received. Go take a massive fucking shit with any toilet paper you want, because I'm not going to plug what brand you should wipe your ass with. The whole Proxyopoly report right here, you can print off yourself and wipe your ass with by going to the Patreon, which can be found on the Linktree, which is linktree/nascarcosa. Moving on to the next section of this podcast, the board nominee voting recommendations. Based on the previous analysis and applying the Proxyopoly TM voting guidelines with a bias for accountability and balanced governance, we provide the following voting recommendations for each of Spotify's 10 director nominees. Each recommendation is given a for, against, abstain, or withhold with a brief rationale. And it is as follows. CEO, founder, and chairperson Daniel Ek. Proxyopoly TM board voting recommendation against. As co-founder, CEO, and chairperson holding outsized voting power, Mr. X's re-election furthers an extreme concentration of authority with insufficient independent oversight. Thus, Proxyopoly TM recommends a vote against Daniel Ek at the upcoming annual general meeting of Spotify Technology SA. Moving on to the next director up for re-election to the board of Spotify, Martin Lorentzon. Proxyopoly TM board recommendation, vote against. Co-founder and former chair, Mr. Lorentzon is not independent, and his continued board presence reinforces the founder-controlled governance that marginalizes other shareholders. Thus, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting against Martin Lorentzon at Spotify Technology SA's upcoming annual general meeting. Moving on to the next director up for re-election at Spotify's annual general meeting, Shishir Mehrotra. Proxyopoly TM board voting recommendation, vote against. Although technically independent, Mr. Mehrotra's prior role as an advisor to the CEO suggests close ties. And voting against his reappointment signals concern over the board's alignment too closely with management. Thus, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting against Shishir Mehrotra at the upcoming annual general meeting of Spotify. Next on the docket for re-election is Christopher Woody Marshall. Proxyopoly TM recommendation, vote for. Mr. Marshall brings an investor's perspective and industry expertise. As a long-tenured director, a full vote is recommended given his role in audit nominating committees and no red flags in independence. Those shareholders should watch his overboarding and ensure he represents minority shareholder interests. Thus, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for Christopher Woody Marshall at Spotify's upcoming annual general meeting. Next up on the docket for re-election, we have Barry McCarthy. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for Mr. McCarthy at the upcoming annual general meeting of Spotify. Mr. McCarthy's financial acumen and prior executive experience at Spotify as former CFO are valuable. Enough time has passed since his executive role to consider him effectively independent, and his leadership at other companies, for example Peloton, adds strategic depth. Next up on the docket for re-election to the board of directors at Spotify's annual general meeting is Heidi O'Neill. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for. Ms. O'Neill is an independent director with consumer industry experience at Nike and currently serves on other public boards. Her external perspective and oversight on compensation matters warrant support. Those shareholders expect her to advocate for improved governance given the company's control issues. Therefore, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for Ms. Heidi O'Neill at the upcoming annual general meeting of Spotify. Next on the docket up for re-election to the board of directors of Spotify, we have Ted Sarandos. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for. As co-CEO of Netflix, Mr. Sarandos offers crucial media and content expertise. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for his re-election, anticipating that his stature enables him to assert influence as an independent voice despite the founder control. Therefore, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for Mr. Sarandos at the upcoming annual general meeting of Spotify. Up next on the docket, we have Thomas Staggs, up for re-election to the board of directors at Spotify. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote for Mr. Staggs' extensive executive background at Disney and his current media venture experience provide valuable insight. He is independent and has no affiliations compromising his judgment, meriting shareholder support for continuity on the board. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for Mr. Staggs at the upcoming annual general meeting of Spotify. Next on the docket, we have Mona Sutphen, up for re-election to the board of directors at Spotify. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for. Ms. Staggs brings policy and geopolitical expertise as a former White House official in enhancing the board's diversity of thought. Her independence and risk oversight experience justify a for vote as her presence helps balance the board. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for Ms. Sutphen at the upcoming annual general meeting of Spotify. Up next on the docket, we had Padmasree Warrior, up for election to the board of directors at Spotify. Proxyopoly TM board voting recommendation, vote for. A seasoned technology executive and independent director, Ms. Warrior contributes significant tech and innovation insights. Shareholders should vote for her given her independent status and potential to push for stronger governance practice from her outside perspective. Therefore, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for Ms. Warrior at the upcoming annual general meeting of Spotify. In summary, Proxyopoly TM advocates withholding support from the two founders, Eck and Lorentzon, as a protest against the excessive concentration of power and to encourage consideration of governance changes. Proxyopoly TM also advises a vote against Shishir Mehrotra not out of personal deficiency but to express concern that a board seat effectively appointed by the insiders as an A director per the proxy statement does not adequately represent minority shareholders' interests. For the remaining 7 independent directors or B directors, we recommend voting for. These individuals collectively bring important skills and their retention signals continuity. More importantly, a strong vote for independents, coupled with withheld votes for the founders, could slightly rebalance the board's dynamics. For instance, if any message gets through, it's that shareholders value independent oversight and want those directors empowered. Each of the 4 recommended directors has a credible track record and no acute governance concerns like conflicts of interest or poor meeting attendance, as none were indicated in the proxy statement. This approach aligns with the proxy voting policy and guidelines of Proxyopoly TM, which often counsel shareholders to withhold support or vote against insider directors, being those responsible for problematic governance, while supporting those who can act as stewards for shareholder interests. We acknowledge that given the voting structure, these recommendations are largely symbolic. The founders' voting control means all directors will be and have been elected regardless. However, the one-sentence rationales provided minimally serve to register the key point. Spotify's board would be better balanced with fewer insiders and more truly independent influence. A notable protest vote in the record, even if not defeating a nominee, can prompt discussions internally. For instance, in the 2025 voting results, 36 million votes were cast against Daniel Eck and 46 million votes cast against Lorentzon. A significant number that likely came from institutional investors following policies similar to what we recommended here at Proxyopoly TM. Proxyopoly TM therefore endorses that stance and extends it to Mehrotra to sharpen the message on independence. Meanwhile, all of the independent directors saw over 95% support on the vote in 2025, which we find appropriate. Our recommendations thus mirror a governance-focused voting pattern amid a nudging Spotify toward improved accountability. Even if the immediate impact is limited. And that concludes the second section of this podcast. We will have another intermission to remind the Proxyopolist at home that there is plenty of time on this podcast for sponsored content and contributed content. But this is an independent podcast brought to you by the Jackal of Trades. The Jackal of Trades. Get all your trades from the Jackal. You can find them on the linktree at linktree/nascarcosa. And now this podcast is streaming wherever you get your Proxyopoly podcasts. You can find it on RSS. You can find it on Amazon Music. You can find it on Audible. You can find it on Stitcher. You can find it on Pandora. You can find it on Apple Podcasts. And you can fucking find it on Spotify, for God's sake. Yeah! But I'm done playing devil's advocate for now. Moving on to the supplemental recommendations for governance reforms. While Spotify's current governance profile has yielded a high Proxyopoly TM score, there are several steps the company could consider to address policy concerns and enact structural reforms for better shareholder alignment. These recommendations balance pragmatic changes with aspirational best practices, presented in a constructive, if not slightly dry and satirical tone. Recommendation number 1, phase out the beneficiary certificate supermajority voting structure. Gradually sunset the 10-to-1 voting power differential by converting beneficiary certificates to ordinary shares or canceling them upon any new issuance of shares. Recommendation number 2, appoint an independent board chair or lead director and separate the chair-CEO roles, splitting the roles of CEO and chairperson, appointing a non-executive independent chair of the board, or at minimum, designate a robust lead independent director with clearly defined powers. This is a widely endorsed governance best practice that would introduce a real check on executive decisions. Moving on to Proxyopoly recommendations for policy changes number 3. You can find the full rationale on the Patreon where I publish this full Proxyopoly TM research report if you want the full recommendations and rationale for those recommendations. But I am getting so sick and tired of having to scream at you people to change your fucked up, inconsistent, insulated, autonomous executive power. Number 3, enhance shareholder rights, proxy access, and shareholder proposal mechanisms. Voluntarily adopting a proxy access bylaw, allowing a qualifying group of investors holding 3% or more for 3 years to nominate a minority of board seats on the proxy. Additionally, commit to transparently consider any shareholder proposal filed by owners of a reasonable stake, even if not strictly required by Luxembourg law. Proxy access has become common in S&P 500 companies as a safety valve for shareholder representation, while Spotify's current ownership structure would likely override any proxy access nominees. Its existence pressures the board to be responsible and give minority shareholders a voice in extreme situations. Proxyopoly TM recommendation for policy and reform changes number 4. Introduce an advisory vote on executive compensation, or say on pay. Even if not legally mandated, allow shareholders an annual advisory vote on the compensation of top executives, particularly the CEO. This is a standard in many jurisdictions and provides a channel for shareholder feedback on pay and performance alignment. In Spotify's case, Daniel X compensation might be modest to relative typical CEOs, but a say on pay advisory vote would cover equity grants and the pay of other top executives too. By adopting it, Spotify would show it isn't evading accountability on pay matters. Moving on to Proxyopoly TM recommendation and change and reform policies, you get it. Proxyopoly recommendation number 5, strengthen and rotate board composition. Commit to a policy of periodic board refreshment. For example, adding a new independent director every few years and setting an expectation of term limits or retirement ages for long-serving directors. Also, ensure all key committees, audit, compensation, nominating, governance, are 100% independent and chaired by strong, engaged directors, perhaps rotating chairs every 5 years to bring fresh perspectives. Proxyopoly TM recommendation for policy and reform changes. Number 6, increase transparency on succession planning and risk oversight. Provide shareholders with more disclosure about how the board is planning for management succession, both emergency and long-term, and how it oversees major risks, including environmental, social, and governance issues like content moderation, data privacy, and human capital. For instance, publishing a board report or guidelines on CEO succession would be a start. This addresses a subtler aspect of entrenchment and regulatory evasion. Moving on to Proxyopoly TM recommendation number 7 for policy and reform changes. Evaluate controlled company status and commit to exiting it when appropriate. The board should annually evaluate whether maintaining a, quote, controlled company, unquote, status exemption is still in the company's best interest and set criteria. For example, if founders voting fall below a threshold or as a gesture at certain maturity of market cap, for voluntarily relinquishing those exemptions as a controlled company and complying with standard New York Stock Exchange governance requirements. While the founders currently have over 50% voting shares, if over time that changes through dilution or selling, Spotify could at some point no longer legally be a controlled company. Even before that day, the board could choose to behave as if it isn't one, essentially planning for a more democratic future state now, which in turn might marginally lower the Proxyopoly TM score as these measures take effect. Implementing just a few of the recommendations previously mentioned would likely improve Spotify's Proxyopoly TM ratings. For instance, eliminating or reducing super votes would dramatically drop the proxy accumulation resistance and bylaw fortification index towards a more neutral 0.00 on the Proxyopoly TM index. An independent chair and proxy access would lower the executive entrenchment factor and shareholder hostility quotient, showing the company is not actively insulating itself from shareholders. Enhanced transparency and compliance steps could modestly reduce regulatory evasion measure by demonstrating Spotify isn't avoiding oversight but rather engaging with it responsibly. From a satirical angle, one might say if Proxyopoly TM is a game, these steps are like finally allowing other players to have a turn instead of the founders rolling the dice every time. The serious point is that these reforms would align Spotify more closely with global governance norms without impeding the company's ability to execute its strategy. Shareholders large and small would feel more enfranchised. Regulators would view the company as cooperative citizens of the market, and the board would likely benefit from improved decision-making with diverse input. In conclusion, Spotify's governance to date has prioritized stability and founder control, perhaps appropriate during its rapid growth phase. But as the company matures, shifting to a more balanced governance approach can support its long-term sustainability and shareholder value. By adopting reforms like the ones previously mentioned, Spotify could lower its Proxyopoly TM score meaningfully in future years, demonstrating that it can hit the right notes, not just in music streaming, but in corporate governance as well. Thanks for tuning in, Proxyopolis. This has been the Proxyopoly TM score for Spotify, which is, again, positive 0.48. Thanks for listening, Proxyopolis. Sources from the podcast include a report based on Spotify Technologies 2025 convening notice and proxy statement, Associated Securities Exchange Commission filings and governance risk factors, and the Proxyopoly TM rating framework definitions included in this exclusive proprietary Proxyopoly TM research report, which you are listening to and can be found to read on the Patreon, which can be found on the Linktree. All data and quotes are drawn from these public documents to ensure accuracy in the factual critique of Spotify's governance practices. And here's your final disclaimer, Proxyopolis. The Proxyopoly TM score and accompanying analysis are purely hypothetical for entertainment and educational purposes only. Any resemblance to real-world events is purely coincidental, though with Spotify Technology SA's governance trajectory, reality may be catching up faster than we expect. Thanks for listening, Proxyopolis, and as always, if it ain't Proxyopoly, you're Proxyopolying.